I'm going to try something a little differently today. Normally, for me to kind of relax and ease into this, I like to read something before I start. But I think today I'm going to read it as at the end of this talk. And I'm going to, and also I find I'm really excited to be asked by both the School of Architecture here and the Knowlton Center for Jewish Studies, because it forced me to put together a group of images and works that integrate my interest in my background growing up in an Orthodox Jewish family with my interest in art, fine art, and architecture. So it's a bit of was a bit of a challenge, but then when I look back, I realize how seamless, I hope I can show it that way, that integration actually happened. A lot of my interest in human interaction, function, ceremony, and ritual happened at first, or at least consciously, through my interest in the Japanese tea ceremony, and eventually realized through a commission from the Jewish Museum in New York that why was I avoiding my own background in exploring architectural ideas. So with that, I'm going to step back a bit. Shortly after I graduated from Rhode Island School of Design, School of Architecture, and came to New York City, and the World Trade Center was a big prominent feature on the New York skyline. It wasn't quite finished in 1972 when I came, and most of my colleagues did not think highly of the World Trade Center, and I was trying to somehow be what I might call a bad boy architect by saying I love the World Trade Center. I did come to love the World Trade Center because for me it was such a neutral kind of barometer of changing weather conditions and surrounding landscape. It was a kind of datum or landmark as a very neutral, unpretentious form in the skyline. And so I proposed that a very simple idea that by turning lights on and off in various offices of the World Trade Center, or by pulling the window shade either open, leaving window shade open or closing it at the end of each day, you could then radically transform the facade of the World Trade Center. Let's see. So here is a matrix of possibilities for transforming the World Trade Center, horizontal dissections, to vertical, to transforming iconographically the different landmarks on the, so that the Empire State Building, Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame could actually be relocated to downtown Manhattan. You could also advertise Coca-Cola, the temperature, or World Trade Center. In 1976, as part of a bicentennial celebration, I was asked by the Architectural League to do a feasibility study. And here's my really kind of almost so deadpan, straightforward proposal, which was calendars placed on the windowsills of the World Trade Center on each day of a particular month. It'd either say off or on, and each evening the cleaning staff would consult the calendar, pull the shade down if it said off, and leave it open if it said on. So this never got built. This is an old-fashioned cut and paste collage proposal for this scheme. The concept also was that by advertising Coca-Cola, it would pay for itself one day. And then I realized when I was a student at RISD, having never designed a building and graduating in the School of Architecture, this was during the Vietnam War, and we felt that making more and more architecture wasn't going to really affect or change the world. And as architects, we thought that we could actually make proposals that could make people look more differently at the world surrounding them. And but then I kind of felt the reason I went into architecture is because I loved making things and I loved building. I started working with a very simple set of rules by which I could accrete or build buildings. I was trying to make buildings directly from the subconscious, almost as if you could doodle a building. by making one mark and another mark and another mark that are all very simple, but by adding one to another and predetermining a set of rules, for instance, the kind of materials you would use, in other words, the kit of parts, the overall dimensions of the building, and the process by which you made the building, and the time constraints, you could then rapidly, in perhaps each day, make another building. And this is a building using uncut 8-foot-long 2x4s and uncut 8 feet by 16-foot sheets of concrete. And I would do several of these in this particular category, and like the scientific method, working in a Petri dish, I would change one variable, and after making maybe 20 in one series, I would change one variable and say instead of 8 by 16-foot sheets of concrete, I would transform one set of rules, and I'd say 4 by 8 sheets of plywood. And then undergo the same process. In other words, I was trying to make kind of illogical solutions from a very logical set of rules. So, and then here, 8 foot by 16 feet sheets of glass and 8-foot-long uncut 2x4s. Shortly after that process, I started really getting very interested in, and I was interested in looking at architecture, and I felt that by making chairs could be a stand-in for making architecture, and yet I could work more rapidly and fluently. I wouldn't have to find a client to help me and fund for projects for me. In other words, I could be much more loose-minded if I could work at a smaller scale and I could build the work myself. I found that the use of the chair as a stand-in for architectural ideas became a really convenient device for me to experiment with architectural ideas. So this is kind of a recurring theme in the history of my work, is the scale of a chair, or it might start at the scale of a utensil, a chair, and a small building. And so this series is called Chair a Day. In 16 days, I built 16 chairs, each at 8 hours a day. Each morning, I would set up a set of rules and then proceed to make a chair. So in the previous chair is stacked plywood. This is a broken plywood chair in memory of maybe Alvar Aalto. After soaking a piece of 1/4-inch plywood in water for 7 hours and realizing there was no way that chair was going to drape very gently over an orthogonal frame, I took my car, I set this plywood on concrete blocks, drove over it very carefully, and broke the chair so that it could be draped very gently over that form. The next chair in that series, this is not the next chair, but one of the chairs in that series, was caused because I had just purchased that week a brand new blue Bosch jigsaw, and I was really determined to make use of it. It's since become one of my favorite tools, and I could use it like a pencil. And so I took the chair I had done the day before, I placed each elevation of the chair on a sheet of plywood, and then traced it in pencil, and as quickly as I could, I took my jigsaw and cut out the various elevations of the chairs, and I was left with a series of 6 different drawings of a chair, which I then notched together and used wedges to hold them together. So it's a kind of chair that can be a kind of early knockdown version of an IKEA chair, I would say. This is a chair just as a sake in terms of using time as a variable, using constraints as a variable, premeditating a set of rules to create non-premeditated results, premeditation to create illogic maybe. Here, a chair using the technique of mortise and tenoning, but with my lack of woodworking skills, the mortise and tenon joints were very loose, so I had to wedge the hell out of each joint. But sometimes be careful when you become expert at something, it's time to change, to try to be careful that it doesn't get in the way of ideas. And so the result of this chair is one in which you actually see visually the forces that are acting on that chair as someone sits in that chair and moves in that chair. You really feel that, as we did in architecture school, that moment diagram, you know, beefing up that intersection of where X meets Y axis and so on. Oops, that's the wrong How do I get rid of that? Damn. Okay. This is all 16 chairs that was pasted up for an advertisement for Art Forum magazine, but just to show you the various other variations. Then I'm jumping forward. Those are probably from the 80s, mid-80s. Those 16 chairs, chair a day, kind of like apple a day. That's good for you. And of course, I had them all painted neutral flat gray, like a quick sketch. There's very quick sketch ideas. Then in 2000, last Thanksgiving, this previous Thanksgiving, I was invited by the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg to have an exhibition. I didn't really want to send anything up there, so I gave instructions to the staff. I said, build a cube with studs 16 inches on center, Phillips head black drywall screws 8 inches on center, and half-inch sheetrock interior, 2x4 stud exterior. And with those instructions, I came up to the school, and a group of students and I extended the heads of the sheetrock screws using graphite to the edges of the walls of the interior space. So this is called drywall drawing in memory of Sol LeWitt. This is a drawing that is not generated by me. It's generated by the builder who built the building. So who is the architect, who's the designer, who's the artist? And hopefully it's a complete collaboration between all three of those parties. I'm also very interested more recently in what I would think a new fan of mine, George Perec, who I've just discovered about 2 weeks ago, calls the infraordinary, the things that are so insignificant, but in fact that they become universal. This becomes a kind of microcosm, and yet it's at the scale of the molecule, it's astronomical in a way. So it kind of like has that kind of reference as well. That's the interior of the room. This is a project done, these are not in chronological order. This is a project called I Want to Become Architecture. I always thought I wanted to be an architect, but then I realized I want to become architecture. I wanted to see if I could fit my body. I wanted to be able to put my hand on a tabletop and have my hand merge with the tabletop, my body bleed into a sheetrock wall. What is the difference between fabric and drywall? And so this is a result of those experiments where I was trying to actually embed my body into an orthogonal, not orthogonal, but a planar material like drywall. Then I discovered, after several years, many years after graduating from School of Architecture, and really looking at process and material and construction techniques, I forgot a really important thing about architecture and design and the functional arts, the applied arts, is human function and ritual and ceremony. This is a really major piece. I think it's even dated 1981. I can still see that on there. It's a seemingly insignificant piece. It's only 12 inches by 12 inches, but it's, for me, a turning point in my work because I discovered, what do we mean by human interaction? What is architecture? And what is the relationship between human body and architecture? It's not just human form, as in the previous project, but it's actually eating, sleeping, bathing, conversation, and so on. So this is a small building in which a chair is placed inside the building, 2x4s, from the previous experiments in constructing those other buildings, are woven into the structure of the chair, pass out through slots in the walls of the architecture, and have outriggers that project down into the ground. As a person who sits in a chair inside of a building moves around, it carves away ruts on the outside of the building. And as the person moves in repeated actions, for instance, the television set in relationship to a television set, or a refrigerator, or in relationship to another person, it starts to repeat actions over and over again. As those actions get repeated over and over again, the chair sinks deeper into those ruts, and it has to then continue to move in those patterns. So I thought this is very interesting because I started becoming very interested in ritual and ceremony, and got very interested in the Japanese tea ceremony through this. mostly because I had been reading a lot of John Cage's writings, and that's where some of the inspiration for these chance operations that he used to create music. I was thinking, could you use the same kind of principles of chance and randomness to create architecture? So through interest in Cage and readings of on Zen Buddhism, I became interested in the Japanese tea ceremony and through this kind of experimentation. Here's another one from that same series where there's a chair inside and a chair outside, and one controls the other. And then from that one before, as you can see, this transition, although I'm not sure it's, comes precisely after the fact. Some of these are out of chronological order, but there is a sequence in thinking in terms of my work. I was asked by an alternative gallery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to do an installation for them in their gallery. And a little history of the Mattress Factory is that they are an alternative museum that is really a museum of installation art. And they ask artists to come to the Mattress Factory and spend time at the Mattress Factory, I don't know, 6 weeks, and build projects in the factory, a former mattress factory. So when they asked me to do an installation, I said, well, I'm not an artist, because I like to play it both ways. Sometimes it depends on my audience. I'm either an artist or an architect. Here I'm a little bit of both. But they asked, and I said, well, I'll design you an interior, a bedroom, so that when your artists in residence or your artists come to build projects at the Mattress Factory, they have a place to stay. When the artist isn't working on projects and they are finished, my bedroom becomes a sculptural installation. And what happens here is they gave me 2 rooms in another building they have near the Mattress Factory, a kind of townhouse. I think it's the top floor, and here's the entrance, and there's 1 room here and 1 room here. And depending on how you slide beds through a wall, you could reconfigure the space. So this is a photograph through that door looking this way. And so here is the condition where in one room you have a double bed, in the other room you have a couch. And another condition is you slide the bed through partially, well, you slide one through one side, you have 2 separate individual bedrooms with a couch on either side. And there, if you were alone and you wanted to have a workspace, you can push the bedroom into the bed and the backrests and the lights and the armrests through the wall, flush with that wall, returning the project back to a drawing again, and have a simple double bed in the other space. Very similar concept was for an exhibition I did at Katona Museum of Art, where I purchased a very cheap backyard shed from Home Depot. This happens to be called the Vinyl Milford, and that's what the project is called. And I wanted to turn this little shed into a country cottage, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, living room, dining room, recreational space. But the space was much too small for all of those activities. So like the Japanese house, all of the functions are layered into each other. When you need a bathroom, you pull the bathroom in. When you need the kitchen, you pull the kitchen out of these. And each of those functional spaces or functional piece of furniture create these cocoon-like forms on the exterior of the building that become these projections of what is happening on the interior of the shed. And then in 1988, the Jewish Museum in New York City had asked me if I knew what a sukkah was. Now, for you people here who are not part of the Mellon Center for Jewish Studies, a sukkah is a ritual dining building that Jews eat in for this 8-day holiday called Sukkot, and it's a harvest fest. It basically is a festival that celebrates the harvest, and it's a kind of Thanksgiving festival. And the sukkah is a building that by Jewish law must be fragile. It can't withstand hurricane forces or strong winds. It has to be open to the sky partially so that you, when you eat in this, you're aware of something above you, whether it's sun, rain, or some other being. And it is about the possibility that any one moment we might be homeless. And of course, it also represents the idea of Jews in constant retreat, in slavery, escaping from slavery or the Holocaust, always on the move. So it's about the issues of portability as well. So when the Jewish Museum asked me if I knew what a sukkah was, I said, yes, I know what a sukkah was. At Hebrew school, my favorite time of the year was a model sukkah competition. So things have not changed. I tell my students that really my entire life I've had one idea, and I'm spending my whole life figuring out how to resolve that, how to develop that idea. So this was the first opportunity I had one to build in public. And it's 4 quadrants that come together, the 4 sheds. Because it's a temporary building, the building must be wheeled away and placed in storage during the profane time of the year, and then wheeled out. So the idea, the detailing is all about this idea of a kit of parts. Everything inside of the building is color-coded, and it's all hung inside 4 sheds, 4 quadrants. When those quadrants come together, the doors of the sheds open up, become the walls of the building. So as you can see here, there are 4 quadrants. So this was the really first one. It was placed on Fifth Avenue when the Jewish Museum had an outdoor presence for the entire month. No one ever harmed it. And this is a configuration, the plan of it. So you can see these are the 4 sheds. And the kits, the elements of the shed come out and become benches and a table. And the structure of the shed, of the furniture, passes through the walls of these sheds. And these doors, which normally close the sheds, create walls that allow 8 people to have dinner together under the sky. And here's another configuration where these could be actually freestanding small pavilions and little seating areas. I did several proposals and models for these little buildings. The reason I really liked the scale of these small buildings, because this was really basically the first time an opportunity to move from furniture scale to building scale. And I really like the idea that you could make, I'm not saying the work is significant and important, but you can make significant, I'm popping my peas, you can make significant statements with small architecture, with small buildings, where of course you can make significant statements on a 2-dimensional canvas. And we know that art changes the world as much as architecture can change the world. But I thought that I was really trying to make a statement that, very different from less is more kind of idea, but that small can be profound. A piece of furniture can be profound. A utensil can be profound. A small building can be profound. So the opportunity to move from my interest in the Japanese tea house to my background was very important to me. This was another proposal which I did not build, but I'd love to build at some point. And it's called Earth Cast Sukkah, maybe, or I forgot what I call this. But it's really based on, in many ways, the Amish barn raising ceremony, where you build 4 walls on the ground, and then the community comes together, and action is choreographed by the community. The building of architecture is not just the ego of an architect, but it's the whole community involved. So what the idea here is, it's like the idea of a barn raising, but here 4 walls of a sukkah are cast in Israel on the ground, are shipped to the United States, to the Jewish Museum in New York City, and are raised like an Amish barn raising and made vertical. The exterior of the casting picks up the imprint of nature on the outside, coming from another. So I'm displacing the earth from one country to the United States, and then it's buttressed on the outside like a Gothic cathedral. So it's very minimal on the interior. It's steel troweled concrete on the interior, it would be, and then very rusticated on the outside. So you have this contrast between, interior, exterior, and the structure that's holding it up. We need to have faith that the structure is being supported. So in Gothic cathedrals, it must have been really freaky to go into these buildings and not quite understand how those things stand up, because the structure is exterior to the interior. So very important. This was another proposal for that same sukkah that I did. This is called, this is a sukkah in which it's made up of sheets of plywood. Each sheet of plywood is one chair. Like the Chair a Day series, and this is where my ideas flow from one into another, trying seamlessly to flow from one to each other. It's just a natural evolution, a kind of research. I don't think of the work as making art. I don't think of making architecture. I think of myself as searching and researching. And so here I'm taking my Bosch jigsaw in a very different way. I'm cutting the elevations of the chairs, which then become the furniture on the interior, become the fenestration on the building. The roof of the sukkah, which needs to be open to the sky, is actually the tabletop, which has been pulled down from the roof to become the horizontal plane on the interior. And then I got a chance to actually build this in Israel at a company that made furniture. And this is a modular sukkah in which there are 4x8 sheets of plywood. And there are these edging, which is kind of like a giant hinge, and they pop into each other. And these are the chairs that have been placed inside. And those chairs pop out and go inside. This is the table. And the table, which I don't have a photograph of, is actually cut out of the ceiling. So more than 50% of the ceiling is exposed to the sky. And the table comes down from above. And you can see the silk-screened hard edge of the furniture. And my hand, using a Bosch jigsaw, cutting the edge of the table so there's an imperfect, quote, imperfect human edge next to a machine precise edge. So it's all about the idea of the ritual, which is about nature and technology, you know, and so on. This comes, this is awkward. This is a project which was commissioned by University of Massachusetts in 1990. This is called Crate House. And I was doing a picnic area at a place called the DeCordova Museum nearby, which happened to be around the corner from Walden Pond in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Not far from the Gropius House that's in Lincoln, Massachusetts as well. Very inspired by Thoreau and Walden. And the relation, I loved reading the book, especially when Thoreau talks about waking up to the smell of a freshly planed pine door jamb, the smell of architecture. We were talking about that today in one of the crits. The smell of paint, how that can give you a different, you know, we don't think in architecture or painting, smell of things and how that can, as significant a construction detail as how to keep water from entering into a building. I always think we make architecture so well today that we don't have creaking floorboards. We don't have steam leaking from radiators when the steam comes on at 6 o'clock in the morning to wake us up. There was nothing more warm and homey than early in the morning and at 431 French Street, Bridgeport, Connecticut, where I grew up. In the morning, we had forced hot air. The ductwork would expand and contract and creak. And it was a sound that meant so much to me. And I'm thinking that we need to make architecture not so well anymore. So this is so maybe we need to do an unstructured course. So we're back to Crate House. It was a little bit of a diverging thing. How did I get here? I don't know. But this is Crate House. Walden, Thoreau, the smell of pine door jambs. But I'm also an egotist. I wanted to make a cabin that was smaller than Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond. Could I make a house inside of an 8-foot cube? You know, the cube is such a generic element in the history of art and architecture. It's tofu. It absorbs everything. It has great flavor. But the flavor comes from the artist. Cube is a great thing. The cube is for me, is like a chair. It's like so neutral. It can take on flavor. It can take on philosophy. It can take on ecology. It can take on humor. It can take on absurdity. It can take on seriousness. But so this is an 8-foot cube. Each room of the house is in a crate. And the crates are the size in profile of a standard 6'8" by 3-foot wide door opening. And each room is in a crate. The crate, I think, somehow, I was thinking about, when you crate artwork, when you pack artwork away, you pack it in a crate. I don't know if this came after the fact, or I'm just thinking of this now, but somehow this idea of crating our lives and taking what we know is so, we don't know what's so familiar to us. It's again what Perec talks about, the infraordinary. The daily newspapers aren't talking about daily events. It's like they only talk about the extraordinary things in our lives. So we really maybe need to have real daily newspapers that talk about little tiny insignificant moments in everyday life. This is what I'm trying to do here, is to take and crate what's so normal. The frying pan, the knife, the rubber spatula. Of course, I had to put a Campbell's soup can in memory of Andy Warhol. It was a great influence on me. That chair and furniture comes out from that crate. But when you want a room, you have to slide the kitchen out, and then you have to slide the living room into the cube. So this is the living room cube. Again, I'm thinking that what I'm trying to make is a kind of diorama. We're looking at our normal life in a very frontal way, as if it's a diorama, as if you might see this in a museum of natural history, but we're not looking at ancient relics. We're looking at the present, the everyday, the insignificant. Here I was trying to look more deeply, kind of like a microbiologist. Instead of the house was too complicated for me, I wanted to just look at one aspect of our lives, which is making coffee in the morning. I couldn't very well use the tea ceremony because it would be kind of pretentious. But coffee is okay for an American to explore as a ceremonial thing. I took apart a Braun AeroMaster coffee maker into all of its manufactured parts, and then I included instructions along the bottom, right here, and a screwdriver and pliers, so that I'm trying to make people think about slowing down maybe. That when you make coffee in the morning and you turn the water on in the sink to make the coffee, that you actually consider where that water came from. And could you make water coming from a sink? As architects, I think we need to teach, and we need to preach, and we need to tell people that, there's something really special about this thing called water, or gravity, or outside, inside, and all of those great things. So it's really, I'm kind of a preacher, I guess. I think we all are. I think artists are preachers and teachers. And so when people say my work is didactic, I think it's a compliment. I know it's not meant to be. But this is another Braun coffee pot taken apart, where all the plastic stuff in between the functional elements have been removed, so that we're looking at just the pure function of making coffee. Now, this is a project that comes shortly after Crate House and after the coffee dissection experiments. This is called Gardening Sukkah, and I'm really pleased because the Columbus Museum of Art has accepted this into their collection, so you're going to have this soon on show. So this is called Gardening Sukkah, and it was commissioned by the Aldrich Museum of Art for an exhibition on called the Judeo-Christian, it was called Faith. It had to do with Judeo-Christian something. But they commissioned me to do this project, and it's called Gardening Sukkah. I took into consideration this idea that the holiday only lasts 8 days. What do you do with the building when it's not the holiday? How do you collide the sacred and profane into the same building? So this building has a roof that slides open when it's the holiday, and it closes up and becomes a shed for storing gardening tools. Because this is a celebration of the harvest, I was trying to bridge the gap between harvesting and growing, that it's one continuous cycle. Where do you draw the line between the sacred and the profane? So these things merge together and become one structure. And of course, because it's related to the idea of escape from slavery in Egypt, it's inspired by the idea of the wheelbarrow. So I merely extended the floor joists, as you can see here, these floor joists, which are extended floor joists, which become handles so that 3 people can move this shed. It's inspired by this wheelbarrow, which is made out of ash, which is typically used to make farm implements and handles for shovels, rakes, hoes, and so on. That's a section and plan through the building. Put that in for you guys who are architects. This is important because the 2 windows, the window on this side of the building is smaller than the window, and people don't quite know why. It's because of perspective view through that building. If you had, it allows you to see through the building when you're moving it around. That's the interior of the sukkah with the ceiling closed, showing on one side the dining utensils, on the other side the farming utensils. What's the difference between a rake and a fork, a spoon and a shovel? So I'm trying to make this dialectic between, again, the eating and the growing, bringing these and colliding those 2 things together. And part of the ritual is that the roof is decorated with growing material like corn husks or pine boughs, and it's a family ritual to decorate the sukkah, to hang fruit and vegetables from the rafters of this sukkah. So it's about this attic space. The attic was the place where you dry herbs and vegetables in the attic, and the cellar is where you keep things cool. There's no cellar here. Maybe that's the next sukkah, is the cellar attic sukkah. Anyway, here's some details. And it even comes with 2 yarmulkes, candles, candlesticks, and wine glasses. And by the way, the yarmulkes are dyed the same color as the ceiling. So when the ceiling's open, you see a little bit of the blue, and it references the sky so that the people inside wearing the yarmulkes are actually wearing a roof, a ceiling, a secondary structure. They're the columns that are supporting something else. This is based on my, again, early transformation from tea ceremony into westernized version of a tea ceremony called Coffee Seeks Its Own Level. If 4 people sit at a table drinking coffee and one person arrogantly lifts the coffee in an undemocratic way, like my wife here, it overflows all the other cups and makes a real mess. So this is an enforced ritual. All people need to raise their cups simultaneously. And this is very important in the tea ceremony. Who drinks first? Who's host? Who's guest? There's so many wonderful little things going on in that ritual. I always bring my students. I teach graduate interior design at Parsons. A plug for Parsons graduate program. Anybody interested? And I always bring them to a Urasenke Tea Ceremony Society in New York, which is an amazing place. And they have demonstration tea ceremony because I think the detailing of that ceremony and the architecture that is adjacent or reinforces the ceremony reinforces the ritual reinforces the ceremony. It's so seamless, and it's a beautiful thing, especially for designers, to see the detailing that happens when those things kind of vibrate together. So here's what happens. The previous tablecloth got destroyed. And then I use the tablecloth because, we use architects and fine applied artists take constraints, take problems, and make them into what's positive. And so here, the stains left over from the previous project are covered by making coffee cups which are both exaggerating the stain and hiding the stain simultaneously. So they obliterate and reinforce the stain. Then I tried, this was a series of experiments where I wanted to see what is the difference between an idea and reality. I was thinking about that famous painting that Magritte did, This Is Not a Pipe, and I don't know how translation to French, where he was making the point that it's not a pipe, it's pigment on canvas. It represents a pipe. I really wanted to make a painting that you could smoke, or I wanted to make a drawing of a chair that I could sit on. So as architects, I don't know, lately most people don't use this anymore, but this is buff tracing paper. I'm sure, you know, some of us old-timers know all about, you know, using rolls and rolls of this, I guess they call this bumwad or buff tracing paper. Very cheap, very flimsy, very lightweight. So generate ideas very quickly. Work in layers like we do in Photoshop and other programs. But here I wanted to make something so flimsy that could support my body weight. I was trying to bridge the gap between fine art and applied art. I didn't quite get it here because here the chair, not only did it not support my weight, it wouldn't support itself. Whereas this one did support itself, but it wouldn't support my weight. So it still works within the realm of the applied arts, I mean the fine arts. Here I start to, I think, make some inroads. I did give up on tracing paper and I worked on canvas. So instead I said, could I make a painting that you could sit on? Here, so I took a painting of a flattened chair here, made a painting. The yellow has been cut away here and reversed. This is the back side of the painting. This is the canvas straps here. And then when that comes off the wall, it folds up and becomes a chair. So here is a functional chair that's a painting and sculpture simultaneously. So here's the drawing of a painting of a chair, the chair folding into sculpture, becoming a chair. And there's the chair that supports weight. Based on that idea, many years later, during the last presidential campaign, Pratt Institute was having an exhibition in their gallery of political artists and invited me to commissioned me to do a voting registration booth that would travel around the city, personed by work study students at Pratt. So here's my booth, made out of pegboard, 2 layers of pegboard, and the American flag. I'll show you how it works. So there's some details. There's in my studio out in Long Island, the American flag. It's 12 feet wide by 8 feet tall, used and sandwiched between 2 layers of 1/8-inch thick pegboard. When that flag folds up, the flag is used to hinge the discrete elements together to make the archetypal peaked roof little shack. And that's me folding this thing up into a book form or unfolding it into a shed so that the students could carry this around the city, open it up, and recruit people to vote. This is at Union Square, New York City. So basically, very much the same idea as the folding chair got reused in a new project, and so on. Now, this is a project which maybe has something to do with unfolding or emerging, but this is a sacred Jewish object called a mezuzah, which is very interesting as an architectural idea because it's a scroll of a sacred text from the Torah written on parchment about this, well, it depends on the size. These were about this big. I have a photograph later. And the Jewish Museum in New York asked me if I would make 12 mezuzahs for their various galleries because they didn't have them on their doors. And a mezuzah is a scroll that sanctifies at the point of threshold from outside world to inside world. It's a reminder that there's a transition between one world and another world, perhaps the sacred, profane. What makes something sacred, but it's just a state of mind anyway. So the requirement is that inside of a little box is a scroll, and it has to be removable to check every 7 years by a scribe. It's written on parchment in natural, I think, dyes. And it's in a little, and what you basically do is roll this little scroll up. In 90% of the mezuzahs that you see, they're contained within a little box, and it has Hebrew letters on it that are the Word of God in Hebrew on it, and it's at an angle facing into the interior space. So it's quite an interesting architectural idea to take a door jamb. This does come from the ritual of at Passover when the kind of story goes that the firstborn Jews would be, anyway, it's a Passover story of putting blood on the doorposts so that the anyway, you know the story. I'm drawing a blank now. I should. Anyway, these are the 12 mezuzahs showing how each of these reveals the scroll within this container. And this is what that text looks like on the one side, and that's the back side. And when it's rolled up, you see the Hebrew revealed through, in this case, a piece of glass. In other cases, these boxes erupting, or in some cases, floating out of that door frame itself. All done as if they're little petri dishes, all standard size dimensions, all very minimal, and so on. This is another Jewish ritual object, which I've never actually shown before, but it was an invitational from the Jewish Museum in San Francisco. Invites artists to do kind of riffs on sacred objects. The transition, a lot of this has to do with transitions and thresholds between things. This is a threshold between the Sabbath and the work week. And at the time of sundown on Saturday night, there's a little ceremony called Havdalah, which is about this transition. It's such a bitter transition that to make the easing into the work week a little bit better, Jews pass around what's called a spice box. It has wonderful aromatic spices inside. And they pass them around, and they smell them, they say a prayer. There's also a candle that has 4 wicks that are interwoven with each other. And so this is my riff on the spice box. It's an interactive spice box where you have different spices, and by opening and closing these valves, you control the smell that comes through this spice box. I should show you some antique spice boxes so you get a sense of what they look like. This is another ritual object in Judaism called a tzedakah box, or a charity box. And a very important part of Judaism is giving charity. And so this is a kind of riff also on the idea of giving charity, in which we know that all cultures give charity, and where do we draw the line between Jews and non-Jews? So what I've done is to do a do-it-yourself charity box. In other words, you have like a soup kitchen, or you have canned goods. What constitutes the sacred object but just the putting of coins in a box designated to a particular charitable institution? It doesn't have to be sterling silver, as is often common. It can be just a cheap little box. I remember growing up, my grandmother had about 10 of these charity boxes on her windowsill, and they're always blue and white. And they might come from Jewish Home for the Aged, foster care, and all these things. And every night she'd clean out her change and put them in different boxes. When they got filled up, she would bring them to wherever they brought them. So that's very much a tradition growing up, is this idea of giving charity. So this is my take on it. Instead of, so there are different foods from different cultures. You get this kit. You get a can opener, a pen, a little label. You eat your soup, or you give it to a food kitchen. You empty it out. You put the label on. You put the charity of your choice on that label. Of course, back to Campbell's soup cans. I have to use them. I tried to get the kosher version of Campbell's soup, which is roqueah tomato soup, but I couldn't find it. Oh, wait, what's going on? Oh, that's interesting. This is called scaffold furniture. I won't talk too much about it, but it leads me to another ritual object called the Seder plate. And the Seder plate at the Passover, Passover Seder is like a performance art. It's a performance art thing. It's like it's both ceremonial, but it's a performance. People act out the story of the exodus of Jews from Egypt. And there are certain foods and not so much smells, but foods and ways you act in this meal, that each part of the meal tells a story in a visceral way. So the story is told through a thing called charosis, bitter herbs, a roasted egg, a lamb shank, a burned lamb shank, and parsley or greens. And that's the story. So what I did is I made this thing in which all these different utensils are all exactly at the same height, so that they're all equivalent. Because if they're different dishes, then they're different heights. So they're held up on scaffolding, which then elevates them and makes a point of them. And then, like archaeological objects in archaeological museums, you have a little tag telling you what that is right here, hanging off of that thing. And then this is a project called Two Large Tables at the Hudson River Park. And I know Malcolm, I think, may be here, who also worked on a project for the Hudson River Park in New York with also another location. And my wife and I, who worked collaboratively on public commissions as a public artwork, in which we created 2 tables, 2 horizontal planes, in which the planes are held off the ground, in one case by 30 inches, in another case by 7 feet. They're both exactly the same, 13 chairs. They're in the same position as this shade pavilion over here. But the table is so large that people have to enter into the table, walk into these slots to sit down so that you feel like you are connected with your neighbor through the surface of that table. You are holding up the table. You're like caryatids holding up Greek architecture. It's not quite as sexist because it's both male and female doing the architectural, holding up the building. So when you sit in a chair, you connect it to the roof, across, comes down. So it's really a community table and a shade structure. Very simple pavilion. And there's the detail of the chair engaged in that edge. This is called body language. 2 people sitting at a table, moving back and forth. Legs have pencils in them with springs inside. When you sit down, the pencils go into the legs. As you lift up a little bit and move your chair back and forth, have a conversation, it records your conversation. This is a burned chair in which a piece of charcoal from the burned chair is used to make an axonometric drawing of that chair. So out of destruction comes creation. That's corny. This is 54 proposals for chairs made using the art of xerography. I made a drawing of the standard chair, and using an X-Acto knife, pencil, in one day I did 54 transformations of black marks on paper, cutting, pasting, using Prismacolor, spray paint. In one case, I took all the shavings and sawed erasures from the floor and glued them onto the page. And then I had these things. I said, what am I going to do with these? I went back and I started building them. So you'll see here, for instance, one that's coming up, that one, where 2 people need to use this chair simultaneously, or the chair won't support or won't stand. This is 1 chair equals 2 chairs, which is this one, which is a buff yellow tracing paper, sheathing that drawing as transformation number 40 becomes this one. So they become a kind of high-speed, quick way of working, very quickly, very spontaneously. I don't think of them as chairs. I only think of them as a piece of paper with some black marks. I can violate them. I can destroy them. I can tear them in half. I don't have to build them. But then I come back and I say, which are the most interesting drawings? Then I'm going to build them, like this one. 2 people sit and interrelate to each other. They intertwine. This chair is Navajo white. That is China white. This is self-portrait. The amount of bricks here is equivalent to my body weight. If you look here, the chair is floating 3/4 of an inch off the ground. But we don't notice that those bricks really feel like you're floating when you sit in that chair. So, this is how architects create miraculous events. You can create miracles because we don't really notice that. It's like bunraku puppetry. You don't see the puppeteer holding the puppet. After you're involved in the action of the performance, the puppeteer disappears. He doesn't exist anymore. So how can we do that? This is called desk. And this is the last slide, and I want to read a closing statement, which is what I usually read at the beginning. I always like to read something. But so if you forgive me, this is a short little statement. I climb the scale model of a staircase. As the staircase gains height, it falters and needs additional structure. As I attain height, I falter and question. I build dreams, and I dream of building. Climbing and making is a conscious meditation. I am in and out of control. I am doodling and deciphering. Moving upward into the attic toward enlightenment, or descending toward the basement into darkness toward the unknown. The stair tower is climbing and falling. The staircase is gravity and flight. The stairway is earth and sky. In 1974, I experimented with witchcraft and spirituality. I read On Adam's House in Paradise by Joseph Rickfert and The Golden Bough by Sir Walter Fraser. Don Wall gave me a copy of Architecture, Nature, and Magic by William Letheby. I studied the origins of wood architecture and the many rituals associated with trees. Temple houses and forest houses about 1976 to 78 are examples of these. During the construction of the temple houses, I took a divergent path and built staircase. Each stair placed atop the previous in a mindless and meditative fashion, each slightly offset, reaching higher and higher elevations until the stacked stairs began to topple. I added scaffolding and diagonal bracing to stabilize the stairs and built to greater heights. For many years, the staircase remained in the dryness and warmth of my studio. 30 years of experiments, studies, prototypes, models, stacks of construction drawings, files of preliminary sketches and abandoned projects were stacked higher and higher, toppling over and crashing into earlier projects. A leaning stack of prototypes for the attachment of drywall to 2x4s fell onto me as I was quietly preparing construction documents for 507 mechanical movements for operating a door. Expression became more difficult. I needed longer and longer levers to pry ideas from the clutter filling my mind. There was no room for fresh ideas. I needed to let in the light. I was becoming a stubborn, irritable, and bad-tempered old fart. I threw many non-biodegradable projects into the Southold town dump and placed the biodegradable projects in the forest behind my studio. The pine staircase was placed in a pine grove. Only a few fragments of the staircase remain today. Thank you.